Every morning he rang the bell by the barn, though no horses had come home in 4 winters. He lit the stove for no one, set the table for nobody. Then one snow-heavy dawn, 2 children crossed his fence barefoot, holding nothing but silence, and something in him, long buried, stirred. Part 1. A Bell with No Answer. The Cimarron River didn't freeze that winter, but the ground did. Ethan Brody stepped into his boots with the same slow care he gave to everything else, because nothing needed rushing anymore. Out here, the wind did what it pleased, and the days rolled on without asking. He pulled on his coat, still stiff from yesterday's frost, and stepped off the porch into a world gone white. The iron bell hung by the barn gate. It was small, no bigger than a man's fist, but it had weight to it, memory weight. Ethan gripped the frayed pull cord, gave it a tug. The bell clanged once, twice, hollow, soft. Then silence. No hoofbeats answered, not since 4 winters ago. Still he rang it every morning. Not for horses, not really. Not anymore. The yard stretched wide and flat, broken only by a leaning fence and the sunken roof of the old sheep barn. Snow gathered in drifts around the posts, burying things that once mattered, a saddle with a torn girth, a child's old boot, half buried. The wind swept across the land like it had forgotten names and didn't care to remember. Ethan paused to listen, to the wind, to the silence, to what wasn't coming back. Inside the house, the stove coughed heat into a room that didn't need it much. He made 1 cup of coffee, then another, set both on the table, sat across from the empty seat like a man who still had things to say, but no voice left to say them. The second cup always went cold. That was the rhythm now. Boots, bell, coffee, silence. The porch steps creaked under his weight as he sat, letting the cup warm his hands instead of his gut. Across the field, the line of cottonwoods stood bare. Their branches clawed at the sky like they, too, were waiting for something to return. Sometimes he wondered what the point of keeping the place was. Then he'd hear the bell, if only in memory, and the sound kept him one more day. That morning he didn't expect anything different. He'd fed Whiskey, the half-blind mare that stayed out of habit more than loyalty. He'd checked the traps, found nothing. He'd oiled the hinges on the barn door, though it didn't need it. That's when he noticed something off. Tracks, not hoofprints. Too small, barefoot. He followed them without thinking, like a man walking through a dream. They led from the broken fence near the southern ridge, cut across the frozen field, and vanished near the barn. He stepped inside. It was dark, warmer than outside, but still cold. He didn't call out, didn't need to. In the far corner under the empty feed rack, 2 shapes curled together. A girl, no older than 10, sat upright with her back to the wall. Her brother, he couldn't have been more than 5, was tucked into her side, buried under what looked like a worn quilt and the girl's own arms. Ethan's boots scraped the ground. The girl looked up. Her eyes were not frightened, just quiet, like she'd cried already long before the snow began. She didn't speak right away, didn't scramble or explain. She just met his gaze like someone who had no more reason to lie. Then she said it, software, matter of fact. "Our mama died this morning." Ethan didn't move, not for a long time. The boy stirred, coughing. His lips were cracked, cheeks red with windburn, but he was alive. The girl tightened her grip around the bundle beside her, a cloth bag, heavy and carefully held. Not food, Ethan figured, not clothes, something else. She was still watching him. No tears, just waiting. He finally cleared his throat. "You come far?" She nodded once. "From over the ridge." She shook her head. "Farther," that's all she said. Ethan glanced around the barn. The old hayloft ladder was gone, the tools rusted. He'd meant to clean this place out come spring. Now it held more than dust. "You eaten?" Another nod, this time from the boy, who barely opened his eyes. Ethan sighed, not annoyed, not concerned, just tired. But he stepped back, motioned toward the house. "Come on." The girl stood first, helping her brother up. His legs buckled once, but he clung to her sleeve. The cloth bag bumped against her side with each step. They followed him without question. No names exchanged, no promise made. Only the sound of boots crunching snow and the soft creak of the bell as the wind caught its pull string again. One more time that day, it rang. Software unnoticed by most, but maybe, just maybe, heard by someone who needed it. Part 2, Two Shadows in the Snow. The wind off the Cimarron had teeth that day, sharp, gnawing, and old. It didn't blow like a storm trying to roar. It just pressed in, steady and bitter, the kind of cold that didn't make a sound but found its way through wool, through skin, through bone. Ethan Brody had been mending the fence along the south pasture, though the cattle had long since been sold and the sheep barn hadn't seen life since the year the war ended. He wasn't fixing it for any practical reason. Habit was a strong thing when a man had run out of reasons. He stood up from his crouch, hands raw from barbed wire and cold steel, and looked across the white. The horizon disappeared into a blur of ash-colored snow. You couldn't see where the land ended and the sky began. That's when he saw them. Two small figures, barely more than outlines at first, pushing through the drifts like they had no business surviving. The older one, a girl, maybe 9 or 10, dragged something behind her, an old flour sack turned gray from the weather. Her coat was too short for her arms. The boy with her was smaller, 6 perhaps, and each step he took looked more like a stumble. They didn't see the house, didn't see Ethan. They went right for the sheep barn, the one with the door still hanging half off its hinges. She didn't knock, didn't hesitate. She pushed the boy inside, followed him in, and the door flapped once in the wind behind them. Ethan didn't move at first, just watched. Something in the way she walked, chin down, one hand always reaching back to make sure the boy was there, felt old. Too old for a child to carry. He set down the pliers, wiped his hands on his coat, and started walking. The barn wasn't locked, hadn't been in years. The roof still held mostly, though one corner leaked when the snow piled high. Inside it smelled of dust, mold, and something else. Old hay and cedar, maybe. They were huddled in the corner, wrapped together in an oilcloth someone had left behind last season. The girl turned quick when he stepped in, like a stray dog expecting the boot. She didn't say a word. The boy's cheeks were red raw, snot frozen under his nose. He didn't even look up. Ethan stood there for a long moment. No questions, no anger, no reaching for a badge that wasn't his or a gun he didn't carry anymore. Just looking. Then the girl shifted slightly, moved her weight to cover the boy more. That motion, simple, quiet, was what made him kneel. "You're not from here," he said finally. His voice was dry as the barn beams above. She didn't answer, but her eyes didn't leave his. "You walked far?" Still silent, but she nodded. "How long?" Another pause. Then she said, "Since before the snow started." Ethan looked at her hands, bare, red, trembling. She had tucked the boy's hands into her sleeves. She was giving him what warmth she had left. "That sack?" he asked, jerking his chin toward the bundle. "Yours?" She hesitated, then reached out, dragging it closer. Her fingers curled around the top like it might float away if she didn't hold it tight. Inside the bag was something solid, round by the shape, but he didn't press. It wasn't the kind of day for digging into what folks chose to carry. "You hungry?" The boy stirred at that word. The girl's jaw tensed. "Come on," Ethan said. "Ain't got much, but I got heat." The girl didn't move, but when the boy started to shiver harder, she nodded. Ethan stood, stepped back, held the door open, and let the wind whip in. She rose slowly, steadying the boy, not asking for help. But she didn't flinch when Ethan reached a hand out to steady his shoulder. They walked back toward the house. 3 shadows in the snow now. 1 tall, 2 small, and behind them, that sagging barn door closed itself. In the warmth of the kitchen, Ethan lit the stove and set the kettle on. He didn't ask their names, not yet. Names could come later. The girl stood by the window while the boy sat on the floor closer to the heat vent, still holding that sack. Ethan handed her a rag to dry her face and motioned to the table. "I got some beans and potatoes, that's all right?" She nodded, eyes flicking to the boy. "Nothing fancy?" He reached into the cupboard, pulled out an old can of condensed milk, and placed it on the table, then paused, opened another drawer, pulled out a biscuit, dry and hard, but whole. He broke it in half, laid the bigger piece in front of the boy. The boy didn't speak, just took it in both hands like it was something sacred. Ethan poured hot water into a dented tin mug, stirred in the milk. He slid it toward the girl. She took it with both hands, didn't drink yet, just held it to her lips like she wanted to remember warmth before she tasted it. Outside, the snow was falling slower now, softer, almost like the wind had decided to let them be, for a while. Ethan sat down in the chair he never used anymore, the one across from his own. It creaked under his weight. The fire popped in the stove, and for the first time in months, the house didn't feel so hollow. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. That kind of silence didn't hurt. Not when there were 4 hands holding on to heat and 2 sets of eyes watching to see if they'd get to stay. And Ethan, well, he didn't ask why they came. He didn't have to. He knew what it looked like to run out of places to go. Part 3. We don't got anywhere to go. The wind had quieted by the time the last spoon scraped the bottom of the bowl. The girl sat on one side of the stove, shoulders tight beneath a threadbare coat, hands wrapped around the tin mug Ethan had filled twice now. The boy, Tom, she finally called him once, lay curled on a rug near the stove, the sack clutched against his chest like a second heartbeat. Ethan didn't press. The stew had spoken enough. He washed the bowls slowly the way a man does when he's got no reason to hurry. The girl watched him. She wasn't afraid anymore, but she wasn't settled either. There was a line between her and the room, and it hadn't faded just because he'd shared his last biscuit. The fire hissed behind the cast-iron door. Outside, the storm had left the land blank, untouched. The kind of quiet that held breath instead of peace. "I ain't got much here," Ethan said without turning. "Ain't nobody comes out this way unless they're lost or hunting something. Sometimes both." The girl didn't answer. He set the bowls on the drying rack, wiped his hands on his trousers, then finally sat. She stared into the coals like they owed her something. And maybe they did. "Your mama," he said carefully. You said this morning?" She didn't cry. Not then, but her jaw trembled and she looked down fast. We was under a tarp behind the train depot in Carson's Bluff," she said quietly. "She'd been coughing bad since 3 days ago. I tried to wake her when it got light, but she was cold, real cold, like snow inside." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I waited. I thought maybe she'd still wake up. But Tom started crying. We had no food left, no matches. The depot man, he kicked us off. Said we were scaring travelers. So we walked, followed the road west, then saw the barn." "And you came in," Ethan said. She looked up then, and it wasn't an apology in her eyes. It wasn't hope either. It was the hollow sort of tired you only saw in grown men after war, or in mothers who buried children. Only now it sat on a girl no taller than a fence post. "We don't got anywhere to go," she said. Just that. Not please, not can we stay? Just the fact of it, laid bare like snow across a field. Ethan nodded once, then again slower. The boy stirred, coughing. He sat up, rubbed his eyes with the sack still in his lap. "She's Liddy," he mumbled. "I'm Tom." Then, as if saying it aloud changed something, he blinked hard and whispered, "Mama said when she's gone we go where the bell rings." Liddy's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide but not surprised. "You weren't supposed to tell," she hissed, soft and sharp. Tom clutched the sack tighter. Ethan's gaze moved from the boy to the girl, then to the bundle. "What bell?" he asked. The room went quiet again, but not the cold kind, the heavy kind, the kind that fills the space between what's been lost and what might be found, if you're brave enough to open your hand. Liddy stood up slowly, walked to Tom, and took the bag from his arms. She brought it to Ethan and set it down at his feet. "It was our mama's," she said. "From when she worked at the church, they was tearing it down, sold the windows, burned the pews. But she kept the bell. Said it only rings for people who listen, not hear, listen." Ethan knelt beside the bag, fingers brushing the worn edge. He opened it gently. Inside lay a bell, no bigger than his palm. Brass tarnished with age, cracked down one side like a scar. The clapper inside still hung loose. It didn't look like it had rung in a long, long time. Ethan picked it up. It didn't chime. He held it to the light. There was something etched along the inside rim, faint and worn. "Unto the quiet a home." He looked back at the girl. "You carried this all the way from Carson's Bluff?" She nodded. "Ma said it was the only thing that was ours." Ethan set it down gently on the table. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to, because suddenly he knew why the bell hadn't rung. It wasn't broken, it was waiting, and maybe, just maybe, so was he. Part 4. A Meal with No Names. That night the wind slowed its howl and curled into the eaves like a tired dog settling down. The storm had passed, but cold still wrapped itself around the house like an old grudge. The stove cracked and popped, holding the room in a soft orange hush. Ethan stirred the pot in silence. Rutabaga and beans, the last of the lard, a dash of salt he'd been saving since fall. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and there was enough. He ladled 3 bowls, chipped enamel with a blue ring that had faded like everything else around here. One he set near the stove for the boy. One he slid toward Liddy. The third he kept for himself, though he wasn't all that hungry. Liddy accepted the bowl without a word. She sat cross-legged on the braided rug, her coat still on, as if she wasn't sure if she'd be staying. Tom sat beside her, shoulders brushing hers like he didn't trust distance anymore. The boy picked up the spoon, but his hands were shaking. The spoon clattered from his fingers, hit the wooden floor, and rolled once toward Ethan. Ethan didn't say anything. He just picked it up slowly, wiped it on the inside of his sleeve where it was dry, and set it gently back beside the bowl. That small act, quiet, unbothered, filled the space better than any kindness spoken out loud. The kids ate fast but polite, pausing sometimes like they were listening for something outside. Ethan didn't press for names, didn't ask what came next. He just ate. He'd been alone long enough to know when a person didn't want to talk, and longer still to understand that sometimes the silence between people was more truthful than anything they could say. Tom scraped the last of his stew with his fingers. Liddy handed him the rest of her biscuit without looking at him. "Thank you," the boy said, eyes low. Ethan just nodded. After supper, he poured hot water into the tin basin by the hearth. No one moved for it. Not right away. Liddy eventually stepped forward and dipped a cloth, wrung it out, then handed it to Tom. He wiped his face, then hers, careful like an old man might wash a cherished horse. They moved like children raised on edge, careful not to take up too much space, not to ask too much, not to be too loud. They waited after each motion, as if someone might change their mind and send them back into the cold. Ethan banked the fire and stood, stretching his back slowly. He walked to the small linen closet near the stairs, pulled out an old patchwork quilt, and spread it near the stove. "Warmest spot in the house," he said. Liddy nodded once, solemn. Tom laid down fast, curling tight beneath the quilt, the bell sack still clutched to his chest. Liddy didn't lie down right away. She looked around the room, at the shadows, the old chair with the cracked leather arms, the boots by the door. She wasn't looking for danger. She was looking for an absence. "I'll keep the fire going," Ethan said. "You rest." Her eyes flickered, not with trust, but something adjacent. Maybe not fear anymore. She lowered herself beside her brother, one hand slipping beneath the quilt, the other still gripping the edge of her coat sleeve. Ethan moved back to his chair, sat down, and let out a long breath. He picked up the pipe he hadn't lit in months, but didn't strike a match. Just held it between his fingers like a memory he wasn't sure he wanted back. The house creaked in the wind. The bell on the table didn't ring, but for the first time in 4 winters it didn't feel so quiet anymore. It felt paused, like something was waiting, like maybe, just maybe, someone had listened. Part 5. The Thing Inside the Cloth. By morning the wind had wandered off toward the canyon, dragging the storm with it. What was left behind was silence, thick, gentle, and heavy, as snow settled into the bones of the land. The house creaked once with the change, then fell still again. Ethan stirred early, same as always. Years of ranching made a man wake even when there was no herd to chase. He added wood to the stove, slow and quiet, careful not to wake the kids. But Liddy was already up. She sat cross-legged beside the fire, arms around her knees, chin resting on top. Tom still slept under the quilt, one hand loosely curled around the cloth bag they'd brought in with them. Liddy wasn't looking at Ethan, but she knew he was there. The bag was small, worn from being handled more than it had ever been set down. The way the seams were pulled told of too many days on the move. Ethan didn't ask what was in it. He poured water into the kettle, set it over the heat, and nodded toward her. "You sleep?" Liddy gave a single shrug. Tom did. The water hissed as it began to warm. She reached out and gently nudged the bag closer to the fire, not protectively like she wasn't hiding it, but as though what was inside deserved warmth too. Ethan sat down nearby, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to feel like he didn't care. After a long minute, Liddy spoke. Mama didn't want to carry nothing. Said it slowed us down, but she kept this. Ethan didn't reply. He let her keep the reins of the conversation, the way a man might let a wild horse sniff his hand before ever thinking of a saddle. Liddy looked down at the bag. She said it came from a church, one of the last things left standing back where she was born. Ethan could tell by the sound in her voice that back where meant more than just a place. It meant before. It meant another life. She opened the cloth slowly. Inside was a small bell. Brass, worn, the edge dented on one side like it had once fallen from a high place. It wasn't polished or fancy, just a plain bell, the kind meant to call the faithful in small rooms, without stained glass. She said it don't ring unless someone's meant to hear it, Liddy murmured. Said it only sounds when it knows it's home. Ethan leaned forward, not to touch it, just to see. It sat in her palms like something sacred and lost, a thing that shouldn't have made it through storms, through hunger, through whatever they'd crossed to get here, but had. Tom stirred in his sleep and reached out, patting for the bag. His hand found Liddy's and rested there. She carried it all the way. "Liddy," whispered, voice catching, even when she couldn't carry herself. Ethan's throat tightened, unexpected and sudden. He looked away toward the frosted window pane, where the sun had begun to rise without heat. After a while, he stood and poured warm water into a chipped tin cup, held it out. Liddy took it without thanks, not because she wasn't grateful, but because some kindnesses don't need words. They just need not to be broken by noise. The bell sat between them, silent. But Ethan thought he heard something, not a sound exactly, more like the memory of one, like a note waiting to be struck again, like something was listening back. He didn't reach for the bell. He only stood and walked to the coat rack, pulled down his thickest wool, and tossed it across a second chair near the fire. "You can stay as long as you need," he said. Then he walked outside to feed the chickens. Inside, Liddy watched the door close, then looked back at the bell. It still hadn't rung, but for the first time it didn't seem like it needed to. Not yet. Part 6. Old Hands on Old Wood. That evening the storm was gone, but the cold remained, clinging to the corners of the cabin like an old regret that wouldn't leave. The stove puffed and sighed as it kept back the cold, but the shadows still settled heavy in the rafters. Tom had fallen asleep early. The boy had barely touched his stew, then curled near the fire like he was trying to become part of the warmth itself. Liddy sat nearby, her back to the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't speak much after dark. Ethan, restless with a kind of quiet that had crept under his skin, lit the lantern and walked toward the corner of the room that hadn't been touched in years. There, beneath an old oilskin tarp, sat the box. He knelt and pulled it out. The lid had warped slightly, but the hinges still moved, stiff and steady like a breath being held. The wood bore a pattern, carved carefully, a mix of Spanish scrolls and simple prairie leaves, etched when his hands had been younger, steadier, and full of plans. He had carved it for her, his wife, long buried but not properly grieved. She'd been sick, slowly, the kind of sickness that made a man lose hope a handful at a time. By the end, she hadn't wanted a grave or stone, just to be remembered quietly. So Ethan had kept the box unfinished, left it in that corner like a wound he didn't want stitched up. He opened it now. Inside lay a piece of goat hide, half sewn, the needle still threaded through as if the hands that had last held it might come back and finish the job. It smelled faintly of sage and thyme, like the desert after rain. Liddy had noticed. She rose and stepped closer, barefoot and quiet. She didn't speak, just looked. Ethan felt her gaze settle on the carvings. "You made it?" she asked, voice low. He nodded. "For her?" He nodded again. Then, for the first time in hours, Liddy asked something soft, almost unsure. "Why didn't you finish it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He ran a thumb over the dry grain of the lid. The question had weight. It deserved something more than just words. "She didn't want me to remember her in things," he said finally. "Said I'd look at the things and forget the sound of her voice." Liddy was silent. Then, after a beat, "But you kept it anyway." Ethan looked up. Liddy's eyes weren't accusing, just wide and tired and trying to understand the way people hold on to things even when they say they've let go. He nodded. "I did." The fire cracked, throwing light across the room like shadows remembering how to move. Ethan reached into the box and lifted the half-sewn leather. His hands, calloused, thick, older now, held it like something living. "I was gonna make her a saddlebag, one she could take on the wagon. Never got past this." Liddy looked down at it, then at him. Maybe you could finish it, she said. Her words weren't a suggestion. They were an offering. Ethan blinked. He hadn't stitched leather in years. His hands had nearly forgotten the feel of it. But now, under the quiet of the girl's voice and the sleeping breath of her brother by the fire, the idea didn't feel so far-fetched. He didn't say yes, didn't need to, because he set the box gently on the table, took out the hide, smoothed it. Liddy returned to the fire and sat down. The bell still sat near the hearth, untouched, but something else was beginning, not with a ring, but with a thread pulled through old leather, and a man remembering how to finish what he once began. Part 7, the third one knocks. The knock was so soft, Ethan thought it might have been the wind brushing a loose board, but whiskey stirred in her stall. Not a snort, not an alarm, just a low rumble like she knew someone was out there. Ethan stood, leaving the needle and goat hide on the table. He stepped to the door, pulled it open, and let the cold speak first. There, standing beneath the last streaks of moonlight and wind, was a boy. No older than 12, maybe 13 if the hard winters had cheated him out of softness. He wore a patched coat too short at the wrists and a red scarf wrapped twice around his neck, the color dulled by time and soot. His boots were soaked. His hands, one of them holding a leather satchel, were roughened like he'd been working since before his voice ever dropped. The boy said nothing, just looked up at Ethan, and then down again. Ethan didn't ask who he was or what he wanted. Some things didn't need to be asked, not when a person's standing in the cold and not complaining about it. Behind him, Liddy stepped into view. "I know him," she said softly. "That's Jose. His daddy used to make boots for the ranch hands. He fixed Mama's kettle once." Ethan stepped aside. Jose walked in like a shadow slipping through a fence post. No apology. No thank you. Just the look of someone who had nowhere left to be and less to prove about it. The boy sat near the stove and unwrapped his scarf. Steam rose from his clothes. Liddy brought a dry blanket and handed it to him without a word. Jose nodded barely. He didn't speak until Tom stirred and blinked up at the new arrival. "Who's that?" Tom mumbled, still half in dreams. "Nobody yet," Ethan said, "but we got room." Ethan went to the pot and stirred what was left of the cornmeal. The smell filled the cabin, simple, strong, the kind that sits in your bones and makes you forget your stomach's been empty too long. He dished out a fourth bowl. Now 4 plates sat on the table, 4 chairs filled, 4 breaths mingling near the firelight. No names spoken, no stories offered. Just the hush of strangers gathered not by blood nor promise, just circumstance and something quieter. The fire cracked again and Jose looked up, his voice barely above the rustle of ash. "I walked 2 nights from Rutten Pass. The place was empty. I thought I'd find him here." "Your father?" Ethan asked. The boy didn't nod, didn't shake his head either, just lowered his eyes and said, "He used to say if the trail ran out, Mr. Brody would know where it bent." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He just handed the boy a spoon, and Jose took it with both hands like it weighed more than silver. Later that night, while Liddy tucked Tom into the wool blanket, Ethan set another log on the fire. He looked at the 4 bowls drying near the sink, the sound of wind outside and the soft snore from whiskey in the barn. There was no plan here, no promises made, but somehow, under the old beams of that roof, 4 people who'd each been left behind were warming in the same circle of light. No one called it family, not yet, but no one left either. And in the West, sometimes that was all the start a story needed. Part 8. Smoke that brings back the dead. The night was colder than the last. Though the wind had gentled, snow clung to the corners of the windows like lace from another life. Inside, The heat of the stove had turned the room soft around the edges, warm enough to let your shoulders fall, if only for a minute. Ethan sat by the hearth, oiling the creak from an old leather strap. Jose whittled a small piece of pine into something that might have been a fish if you squinted. Liddy sat on the floor with Tom curled in her lap, half asleep. His breath fogged the space between her collar and his cheek, and in that quiet, she reached into the pocket of her mother's worn coat. It was stitched shut, but she'd opened it the day before with a dinner knife, careful and slow. She hadn't shown anyone what she found inside, not even Tom, but tonight she pulled it free. It was a bundle wrapped in blue cloth, faded to gray. When she unfolded it, a small twig of dried sage fell into her palm, crushed at the edges, still holding its scent. Liddy got up without a word, walked to the stove, and lit a sliver of kindling. The tiny flame danced at the tip of the wood like it remembered things too. Then she held the sage over it. Smoke curled up, not thick, not wild, just a ribbon, slow and steady. It drifted across the rafters, up the walls, into the cracked floorboards, and wove in places no one thought to dust anymore. And Ethan turned. He didn't move fast. He didn't speak. Just lifted his head like something touched him on the back of the neck. That smell, it didn't belong in this moment. It belonged 5 years ago, in a room where a woman used to grind sage before sleep because her dreams would run wild without it. She used to say it kept the restless things away. Ethan stared at the smoke, then at Liddy. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He stood, crossed the room, and reached his hand over the stove, not to put the smoke out, just to cup it, gently, to hold it there a little longer. The sage smoldered in her hand like a memory too strong to scatter. And for the first time, Ethan saw something of his wife, not in the face of the girl, not in the smell of the sage, but in the act itself, in the way it was done, quietly, on purpose, without a cry for attention. Jose watched from the corner, eyes lowered, whittling slower now. Tom shifted and murmured in his sleep. Liddy tucked the sage's stem back into the cloth and folded it 3 times before slipping it beneath the stove's stone base. No one asked why. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The roof no longer creaked with new weight. Just the sound of old wood settling and the fire breathing low. Ethan poured the last of the warm water into a tin cup and left it by the stove. "Your mama," he said, his voice low as the embers. She was good at quiet things, too. Liddy didn't answer, but she sat closer to the fire after that and left the cloth unwrapped beside her. Part 9. Forgotten by the Town. It was just past midday when the knock came. Not on the door, but from the ground. Hooves, slow, intentional. The kind that didn't belong to a traveler passing through, but to men who made themselves known by how little they hurried. Ethan didn't look up right away. He was out back, chopping wood with the same methodical rhythm he'd had for years, each swing like a heartbeat against silence. Liddy was washing a tin plate in melted snow. Tom played with a twig and a tin can, pretending it was a horse and buggy. Jose, near the fence, leaned on the post like he'd always belonged to the landscape. Then the horses came into view. Reverend Graham rode up first, stiff in the saddle, his gloves too clean, his eyes tight like he was holding in judgment he thought might leak if he breathed too deep. Beside him was Calder, one of the councilmen, fatter, red-faced, his breath visible in the cold, like he was angry just to be out here. Ethan stopped splitting wood. They didn't dismount. "Brody," Graham called out, "we've been hearing things." Ethan picked up a log, set it aside. Didn't answer. "4 of you living in there now?" Calder pressed. "That's a fine little family you got. Just missing—" "Oh, I don't know. Is anything legal?" Tom stood up and took a step behind Liddy. Jose didn't move, but his hand slid down the fence post, near the knife he'd tucked there days ago. I don't recall the county signing off on an orphanage run by a widower with no kin, no church standing, and no papers, Graham said, voice brittle. That ain't how it works. Ethan wiped his hands on his trousers, walked towards the porch. He didn't climb the steps, just stood there, hat in hand, the wind pressing the silence tighter. He didn't argue. He never had. Not when folks came for him after his wife died. Not when the land dried one summer and he was blamed for digging his trench too close to the neighbors. Not when his name was passed around like a problem too big to deal with but too quiet to confront. But he wasn't the first to speak this time. Jose stepped forward. My father worked for Mr. Brody 10 years ago, the boy said, accent steady, eyes locked with Calder's. When our barn burned, he brought us food before the sun was up. My mother said we were dead without him. Graham frowned. Boy, this ain't about the past. No, Jose said. It's about now, and now I stay. Calder's lip curled. You got a mouth. Jose nodded. So do you. But one of us is telling the truth. Ethan's jaw twitched, but he still didn't speak. He just glanced at Jose, not with pride, not with surprise, but with something gentler, like a man remembering a favor once given, now returned, in silence. Liddy came up behind them, clutching Tom's hand. Reverend, she said, voice shaking, Mama said God listens better when folks ain't yelling. Graham blinked, looked away. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind tugged at Calder's coat like it wanted him off the property. And maybe it did. Finally, Graham tugged his reins. We'll be back. They turned without another word. The horses' hooves disappeared into the distance. Ethan watched until they were gone, then turned back toward the porch. Jose picked up the axe, started stacking the wood Ethan hadn't split yet. No one told him to. No one had to. Inside, the stew simmered again. 4 bowls on the table, and a 5th, just in case someone else got brave enough to knock. Part 10. A question that stopped a man cold. The snow had eased into a kind of hush, not quite melting, not quite falling. It just hung in the air like the town's judgment still lingering at the edge of the property line, but inside the Brody homestead, things had returned to a quiet rhythm. Slow meals, shared chores, and words only when they needed saying. That morning, Tom followed Ethan out to the hayshed. The boy hadn't asked, just pulled on his patched coat, shoved his bare hands into his pockets, and walked a few paces behind Ethan's long stride, boots crunching softly in the frost. It was the first time he'd come along without Liddy beside him. A small thing, but it meant something. Ethan didn't say no. They fed the goat first, only one left, an old nanny named Pearl that chewed like she was remembering better years. Then came the hay. Ethan showed the boy how to tie bundles from the loose straw, loops, pull, tighten. The knots weren't clean, but they held. Tom worked hard but quiet, tongue tucked into the corner of his mouth. His hands shook some, from cold or from being sick, but he didn't stop. Ethan tied the last bundle, set it on the pile. And that's when Tom asked, "If you're bad," he mumbled, not looking up, "why'd you feed us?" Ethan froze. His fingers still held the twine, knuckles white against the winter air. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Tom didn't press. He just kept fumbling with another knot. The words had come out like a thought spilled by, accident, quiet, not mean. But they hung there in the air, heavier than snow, older than regret. Ethan looked at him then. The boy didn't flinch. "I mean," Tom added, after a beat, still not meeting his eyes, "bad folks don't make fires for nobody, and you got soup." The corner of Ethan's mouth twitched, like a smile nearly remembered. but he didn't speak, just gave a slow single nod, and for Tom, that was answer enough. The next morning, Liddy caught it first. Instead of calling Ethan that man or him, Tom said softly, "Mr. Brody said we can use the good pan today." She said nothing, just blinked, but something loosened in her shoulders, like maybe they'd stopped running, even if their feet hadn't moved. Later that night, Jose told a joke at the table, something about a burro that thought it was a rooster. It wasn't funny, not really, but Tom laughed anyway. Ethan didn't say a word, but after supper he cut a second piece of cornbread and slid it onto Tom's plate. And Tom didn't hesitate this time. Part 11. The Sign That Waited. The sky was slate gray when Ethan pulled the cedar plank from behind the barn. He'd cut it the winter his wife got sick, intending to carve her a sign for the herb shed she'd dreamed of building. June's garden, she'd wanted it to say. He never finished it, never even started, but the wood had waited, like so many things around this place, that still bore her absence like a second skin. Now Ethan carried it to the front porch where the wind didn't quite reach. He sat on the steps with his back against the post, knife in hand. No coat, no gloves, just a worn flannel shirt and sleeves rolled back. Jose watched from the corner of the yard, whittling his own stick into the shape of a fishhook. He said nothing, but he stayed nearby. The carving was slow. Ethan's hand didn't move like it used to. The blade slipped once, nicked his thumb, but he didn't flinch. He carved in silence, every motion deliberate, as if the words had been growing inside the wood all along, just waiting for someone steady enough to set them free. No one is just passing through. He sat with it long after the last curl of wood hit the porch boards, then set it gently against the wall by the door, upright but not nailed. Not yet. When he stepped inside, the room was full of warmth and stew and soft voices. Tom was asleep by the hearth, Liddy reading from a Bible missing half its cover. The church bell lay beside her. She looked up as Ethan entered, then down again. Her fingers traced the edge of the bell, the handle polished by her mother's hand, the clapper still silent. She stood, walked to the door without a word, and read the sign. For a long time she just stood there. Then she took the bell from her palm and placed it carefully on top of the wooden plank, like an offering, or maybe like a seal. She didn't look at Ethan, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Maybe it'll ring now." That night, nobody touched the sign again. It stayed by the door, leaning slightly like it wasn't sure yet if it belonged. But it didn't fall. And come morning, Tom set his muddy boots beside it instead of on top, like it was already part of the house. Jose hung a horseshoe above the entry. And Ethan didn't put the sign away, not this time. Part 12. Storm That Didn't Come From the Sky. They came just after sunrise, boots loud on frost-cracked dirt. 5 riders, 1 wagon, all from town. Reverend Graham at the front, stiff in his collar and righteousness. Behind him was Calder from the council, thin-lipped and uncomfortable, even when he agreed with himself. 2 others, storekeep's nephew and the blacksmith's cousin, rode because they'd been told to, not because they wanted to. The 5th was Millie Harper. She didn't dismount, just sat quiet, reins slack in her hands. Ethan had seen storms build before, how the stillness could be louder than the wind. This wasn't the kind that passed with the weather. He stepped off his porch, slow, steady. Calder spoke first, voice too loud in the cold air. "This arrangement, whatever you're doing out here, it ain't legal, Brody. You got no papers for the children, no church record, no kin, no marriage, no name to bind it." Tom peeked through the window. Liddy pulled him back, heart thudding louder than Calder's voice. Inside, Jose stood, jaw tight. "They're not your blood," Graham added. You know that, and the girl, he nodded toward Millie, she's not your wife. Ethan didn't answer right away, didn't raise his voice, didn't explain. He just stood, eyes on the space between the wagon and the frostbit fence post, where a patch of yarrow still held on from summer. Finally, he said, if being kin means sharing blood, there's plenty of families in town that shouldn't call each other that. That hung there, heavy. Calder cleared his throat. We're not here to fight you, Brody. We're here to protect the children. They need to be placed with proper folk, with names, with structure. They need to be placed, Ethan said quietly. Somewhere they're wanted. He stepped back toward the porch. If that ain't here, you'll have to take them from me. Behind him, the door creaked open. Millie stepped down from the wagon then. Not rushed, not loud, just enough to make every head turn. She walked forward, her boots crunching on frost. I suppose a name matters, she said. Graham blinked. Millie. She ignored him. I suppose it matters to the law and to you. So if a name's what you want. She looked at Ethan, then back at the men. Then I'll stay. I'll give it. You can write it down however you need. Ethan didn't move. Not right away. But something in his eyes, something that hadn't lit in years, shimmered like the ice on the edge of the water trough. A flicker, then gone again. Calder stammered. Well, there's forms, and then go get them, Millie said. Graham opened his mouth, then shut it. No one moved. Not until Jose stepped out with 2 mugs of warm cider and offered them without a word. To Millie, to Ethan. The boy didn't wait for permission. And just like that, the storm passed. Not with thunder, but with a choice. And the sign on the porch leaned a little straighter. Part 13. The door that didn't shut. The wind had dropped by dusk, but the cold still crept through the boards, finding its way beneath doors and into the quiet spaces between people. The kind of cold that made memory hurt, not just skin. Inside the fire was low, but steady. Liddy had been sitting with her knees tucked up under her chin, her back to the hearth, her eyes flicking to the window every few minutes. The bell still sat on the wooden sign near the door, untouched, unmoved. When Millie returned, it was without fanfare. She didn't knock. She just opened the door as though she'd always had a right to, and maybe she had. In her hands she carried a pan of cornbread wrapped in cloth and a worn shawl that still held the scent of wild chamomile from a chest that hadn't been opened in years. Ethan looked up but didn't rise. Jose moved over and took the bread from her hands without a word, the way one does when something is already theirs, even if no one ever said so. Liddy stood. She didn't rush, didn't cry, just walked slowly toward the woman now setting her things near the fire. The girl's voice, when it came, was as soft as cotton thread worn thin from too many patches. Can I call you Mama? Millie didn't answer right away. She turned, looked the girl in the eye, and knelt. Her arms came around Liddy without words, slow, firm, and steady, like she was holding something not fragile, but holy. Tom watched from behind the kitchen table. He didn't move forward, but his small hands loosened their grip on the carved wooden horse Jose had whittled for him 2 nights ago. Ethan stood slowly, walked to the window. The wind outside had turned. It was blowing toward the east now, carrying the smoke from the chimney out over the pines and ridgelines. Millie stepped away from Liddy and reached for the window latch. With a soft creak, she opened it, just a few inches, enough to let in the cold, enough to let out the warmth, enough for whatever spirit had been waiting to come in, or to leave. Nobody said anything. But in that moment, in the hush between footsteps and firewood popping, Ethan felt something settle in the room. Something invisible but real. A place had been made, without permission, without explanation, not because of law, not because of blood, because the door hadn't shut. Part 14. The Day the Bell Rang. Dawn came soft and blue, the kind of morning that doesn't rush to warm anything, just lays quiet light over a world that's trying to begin again. Ethan Brody stepped onto the porch, the wooden sign in one hand, the little brass nail and hammer in the other. His steps were measured, not slow out of pain, but out of something older, respect maybe, or certainty. He held the sign for a long moment before raising it to the post by the door. The words carved into pine with his own knife read, "No one is just passing through." He nailed it in with a single careful tap. The bell, still resting on the ledge where Liddy had placed it, rang. Not loud, not sharp, just once, soft as a breath let go after a long time holding. Inside, the fire was already lit. Jose sat cross-legged on the floor, shaving curls from a cedar branch. He was fashioning a fishing rod, one he hadn't asked to make and no one had asked for, but it would be ready all the same. Liddy was folding clothes with care that made the old cotton seem new again. The way she smoothed the sleeves, you'd think they were meant for someone returning soon. Tom sat at the table, a biscuit in one hand, the carved wooden horse in the other. His lips curled up. Not a full grin, but the kind of smile that doesn't tremble at the corners anymore. Ethan leaned against the porch post. He looked out across the snow-covered pines, the thin line of river, blinking in the distance. The wind moved steady now. No longer biting, it whispered through the trees like it had somewhere to go, but no rush to get there. Behind him, the house wasn't a silence anymore. It breathed. It held sounds. A tin cup being set down, wood creaking under someone's step, the slow hum of a woman humming to herself as she washed yesterday off the plates. Ethan didn't say much, but then again, he never did. "Just a quiet line," said low, more to the wind than to anyone else. "Home ain't where you're from," he said. "Well, it's where no one leaves." And he stayed leaning there, one hand resting on the porch rail, the other brushing a speck of dust off the corner of the carved sign. No one passed through that morning, because no one needed to. Family ain't always blood. Sometimes it's just the folks who stay when the snow starts falling. And sometimes, the loudest kind of love is the one that never walks away. Sometimes the people we end up calling family are the ones who showed up when no one else did. They didn't knock. They didn't explain. They just stayed. And maybe in a land where folks are always leaving, the rarest kind of love is the kind that lingers, quiet as snow, steady as firelight. If this story found you in a quiet place of your own, tell us what it stirred in you. We're still sitting by the fire, listening,